Right, so Haugeland was just talking about the difference between Kant's apperception and Heidegger's disclosedness, um, whereas Kant's apperception, transcendental apperception, is about a self-consciousness and a consciousness which is self-conscious and conscious of objects. Heidegger's disclosedness is a self-disclosing, as well as the disclosing the being of objects, and so being important, right there, the difference between the two. And he says, when taken with sufficient generality, a pretty good colloquial paraphrase for disclosing the being of is making sense of. So making sense of objects, which is disclosing the being of objects. He says, I can illustrate and clarify this by reciting a familiar case. Consider the entities that are investigated by fundamental mathematical physics. Electrons, quarks, photons, the properties or states they can have, the basic forces by which they interact, and so on. These are all physical entities, in a specific sense of physical. That is, they are things that there are, according to fundamental physics. Now, in terms of what are these entities intelligible as entities that are and as what they are? Obviously, they are intelligible via physical theory, especially the basic laws that specify how they can and must relate to one another. For instance, what the electromagnetic force is, its essence, makes sense in terms of, and only in terms of, the laws of electromagnetism. And so do electric charge, magnetic moment, and what have you. I think it's supposed to be, yeah. More subtly, perhaps, but just as clearly, that there is such an entity, its actuality, is intelligible as its current, particular standing in just such relationships at determinate locations in space and time. In sum, the being of the physical, the essence and actuality of physical entities, is spelled out by the laws of physics. This being, in terms of which those entities are intelligible as entities, is disclosedness, is disclosed by Dasein, more particularly by what might be called physicist Dasein. On my controversial reading, physicist Dasein is not individual physicists, or something that they all have, but rather the scientific theory and practice of physics that they develop and carry out. But never mind that. We, physicists and their disciples, comport ourselves toward physical entities as physical entities, in terms of what is thus disclosed, that is, in terms of their being. No one could observe or measure an electron or an electric field, or even talk about them, as such, except in terms of that being, or excuse me, except in terms of that being, as spelled out by the relevant laws. It is only in such terms that they so much as make sense to us as entities at all. In other words, disclosure of the being of the physical is the condition of the possibility of comportment toward physical entities as physical entities. This example of physics and physical being is mentioned by Heidegger, Sein und Zeit, 9, 362, but not elaborated. On the other hand, he discusses the being of equipment in considerable detail. Everyday equipment is primarily understood in the skillful mastery of its proper use, what we might call a hands-on intelligibility. What an item of equipment is, its essence, is what it is properly to be used for, what Heidegger calls its employment, or I think world involvement is another translation of that, or the German word is Bewandtnis. I'm sure that's not pronounced correctly. Okay, so what an item of equipment is, its essence, is what it is properly to be used for, what Heidegger calls its employment, which is tantamount to its equipmental role. Okay, so that's the what part. Its actuality is what he calls its availability, Zuhandenheit, that is, its current particular capacity to be so used. These two, role and availability, make up the being of equipment, in terms of which it is intelligible as equipment at all. Our primary mode of comportment toward equipment as equipment is, of course, using it as the equipment that it is. But there are other modes, such as making it, repairing it, looking for it, talking about it, and so on. The condition of the possibility of any of these modes of comportment is that the equipment makes sense to us as equipment, which just is the disclosedness of its being, by lay or professional Dasein. Now, physical being, physicalness, we might call it, is clearly not itself a physical entity. It's not a physical particle, a physical property, a physical force, a physical interaction, or anything of the sort. Likewise, in equipmental being, equipmentality, or equipmentality, we might call it, is not an item of equipment. Are physicalness and equipmentality entities of any sort? Heidegger insists that they are not. They are not anything that there is whatsoever. This is precisely the point of the ontological difference. The idea that being is not anything at all can be hard to get used to. It's even hard to express. Given the point, one strictly shouldn't use the copula is to talk about being, yet the copula is built into the very structure of ordinary language, much as the quantifier is built into the structure of predicate logic. Accordingly, philosophers have tried to say that although physicalness isn't a physical entity, or equipmentality an equipmental entity, they, and with them various other sorts of being, must be entities of some further and somehow special sort. Perhaps the being of ordinary entities is an abstract, ideal, or even divine entity. But then, what of the being of these entities, in terms of which alone they could be intelligible and accessible? So there would be an infinite regress there. Nor is a possible regress the only problem with such traditional suggestions. Another that Heidegger is concerned to avoid is the implication that they make being somehow eternal. It's no accident that the title of his book is Being in Time. But the real payoff for recognizing the ontological difference and reawakening the question of being will lie in the insights it affords us into ourselves and our comportment toward entities as entities. So far, I have mainly been introducing some Heideggerian terminology, including some of the relationships within it and between it and traditional terms. Now it is time to get down to business and see how these things really work.